welcome back to another historical cooking video. My name is Liz. I work here at Jefferson Patterson Park Museum, and we are partnering with the Great Maryland Recipe Hunt to talk to you about food history. Today we are making one of my favorite holiday treats, mince pies. I first tried mince pies when I was living in England, and I really like them, but you can't really find them over here, so I always have to make them myself when I want them. And I'm going to show you how they might have made them back in colonial Maryland. Alright, so for the base of your mince pie, you're going to need some dried fruits. Traditionally, there was also meat in here, but as early as the 1700s, maybe even the 1600s, we are seeing recipes with just dried fruit. So if you don't feel like adding in meat to your mincemeat pie, just stick with your fruit. I have here raisins, and I decided on impulse to try figs. Raisins and currants is a more traditional mix, but I thought figs sounded yummy, so I bought them. The other thing that we're going to need is some candied peel. This is candied orange peel that I made at home last night. It's kind of hard to find in stores, but it is very easy to make yourself. So I definitely recommend doing it. It's super good too to just eat whatever's left over. And then your last fruit you're going to need is an apple. Whatever type of baking apple you like will do well here. Now we're going to want some sugar too, of course, because we need to sweeten this up. And then we're also going to need some spices. So today I'm using clove and ginger, but whatever spices, today I'm using clove and cinnamon. But ginger is another traditional spice, mace, nutmeg, anything like that. Now our last ingredient is our fat. Traditionally they would have been using suet. Suet is quite hard to come by today, so what I have here is shortening, but any kind of fat will do. You just need a fat in there. Alright, so now we are going to mince up our ingredients for our mince pie. Now, as I get started here, I do want to say just real quickly that although this is a Christmas traditional treat, that not everyone in colonial Maryland was celebrating Christmas, of course. There were the Native Americans who had been here for thousands of years before the colonists who had their own traditions. There were also, of course, immigrants coming over who didn't celebrate Christmas, who weren't Christian, Jewish immigrants and the like. And then, of course, there were enslaved persons from Africa being forcibly removed in the Caribbean who had their own traditions and beliefs, and even though they couldn't practice them freely once they were brought to America, they still had those traditions with them and found ways to continue to honor them as much as they could. So Christmas wasn't universally being celebrated. And in fact, not all Christians at the time were celebrating Christmas either. The Puritans were not very big fans of Christmas, and the Quakers also didn't celebrate Christmas. Now, mince pies have a long history of being associated with Christmas. It dates back to medieval times when spices first got introduced to Europe through the Crusades, and medieval Europe kind of lost their mind over spices. They were a big commodity food, a way to show off your wealth. By having a lot of spices on your table or very heavily spiced foods was a way to show off how rich you were. Kind of like truffle and truffle oil today. Every time you want to flex, you put a bunch of truffles on stuff, right? And at that time, pies were a very common staple food. They weren't much like our pies of today. They were largely meat pies, and they would have all kinds of meat that we wouldn't find very savory in them today. A lot of the recipes sound pretty terrible, but they started adding spices and they started adding these dried fruits in the medieval time that came from traditions from the Near East. And that is when the mince pie developed, and it started to be something that was eaten popularly at Christmas. Alright, so I'm just going to keep mincing up this apple. My knife is a little too big for the job I'm doing right now. I forgot my paring knife. Don't do this at home, folks. minced up, but we also need to cut up our figs. And we'll cut up the raisins so they're a little bit smaller too. That way everything is about the same size in there. Now, Christmas traditions is kind of one of my favorite little topics, just because I think it's really interesting how our modern Christmas traditions came about. The Christmas of the colonial Maryland would have been quite different from how we celebrate Christmas today. Instead of where Christmas Day for us is the peak and the end of the Christmas season, for colonial Maryland, that was actually the start of it. They would celebrate for the 12 days after Christmas up until January 6th. So when you hear about like 12th day or 12th night, that's what that's referring to. And that's actually where we get the song, The 12 Days of Christmas, as well. It was getting a gift for each of those Christmas days. It would have started with, you would have had special church services on Christmas Day, of course. But then it also would have been a time for parties, celebrations, feasts, lots of good food, just like we have today, fun, and not a lot of work. It was a time where people who usually had pretty hard work days actually got to have a bit of a break. So everyone, even your laborers, got to get that time off. Of course, that depended on what kind of labor you were doing. There was still domestic labor that was going on, but it was considered a time that a lot of people were supposed to give their laborers a bit of a break. So I'll just keep chopping these up and chop up my raisins a little finer too. All right, so now we are going to prepare our shortening. Like I said, the more traditional filling, or the more traditional fat, is suet. Suet is the fat that comes around from the kidneys, and it was very favored in colonial baking because it had a very neutral taste to it. Remember, you didn't have all of our alternative oils that we do today, so that is what was used a lot in colonial baking, but it's quite hard to get a hold of today. If you have a butcher, you can go and get it from a butcher if you want to be very traditional with it. I have stuck this in the freezer for a couple of hours, and now I'm just running it through a grater because this is going to change the texture of the shortening just a little bit to make it a little more mimic that suet texture. You do still see suet in like suet bird feeders, but don't run out and use that in your cooking. I don't think it's food safe suet. Make sure you want to get proper suet if that's what you're looking for to use. So see, now it has this kind of funky little texture. It'll just mix in a little bit better now. So I'm going to mix in my sugar and my spices, and then I will add this in, and the mixture will be ready to go. So I've added the spices to my sugar, and now I'm adding this to the dried fruit. You want to make sure that you add the sugar and the spices before you add in your shortening or your suet, because it's going to make it much easier to incorporate. And then you can go ahead and add in your shortening, and then you just mix this until it is well combined. All right, looks like my mixture is well mixed now. So I'm gonna go ahead and get my pastry and get ready to make my mince pies. All right, so I am rolling out my crust here. Now, this is a little bit of a modern twist. I really like them with puff pastry. Traditionally, they'd be made with your regular short crust pie dough, but I like them with puff pastry. And I did ask by this pastry. I didn't make it myself. All right, that's pretty good. So now I'm going to cut out my pastry. I have here a nice little tart tin pan, and I have a cutter that is bigger than my pan size. That's very important. So I'm going to cut out a little round of pastry. All right, so now we're gonna go ahead and fill our pies. You can make them in little mini pies like this, which is how I like to eat them, or you can make it in a big pie. And you can make them covered or uncovered, however you like to eat them. I think they're good anyway. Now, mince pies stayed popular in America through the 18th and 19th century, but they started falling out of popularity. They were still eaten pretty commonly in the early 20th century because we know that during Prohibition, they started getting quite boozy. Traditionally, you add a little alcohol into your mince mix, brandy or sherry, something like that. But like I said, during Prohibition, they started ramping up how much alcohol they were putting in the mincemeat mix and just making it absolutely boozy as a way to kind of try and treat Prohibition rules. But some point after that, they just fell out of favor here in America. So I'll just finish filling these up, and then we'll take them to our oven and bake them off. All right, this has been another video with the Great Maryland Recipe Hut. Don't forget to submit your recipes. The link is below. They're really looking for recipes from a wide range of holidays and traditions. So submit your favorite recipe from whatever winter holiday you celebrate, and we'll see you next time. This is not the Great British Bake Off. I'm not making my own puff pastry. Fruit I hate, chopping up dried fruit. It's so sticky and gross. Chopping up dried fruit's no fun.